Alistair is always getting Charles interested in something. Once, when Solomon and Sheba were small, it was archery, and they nearly winged the kittens. Once it was a proposition for removing rock from behind the cottage with dynamite. Fortunately for the cottage, the proposition fell through. Now, unfortunately for me, it was yoga. Alistair hadn't done any himself. So far, he'd only read a book about it, a jolly interesting book, as he said, and when I heard his description, I was keen to read it myself. I wasn't at all surprised when Charles said he was going to get it from the library. What did alarm me, knowing from experience what Charles's enthusiasm could mean, was when, after several sessions of intense study, he announced that he was taking it up. I spoke to Grandma, who had a lot of influence with Charles about that, but all she did, after listening to him intently with her spectacles on the end of her nose, was encourage him. Most interesting, she said it was, and there was a great deal in some of these things. Charles might learn much from it. If she were younger, she would take up yoga too. Well, there we were. Charles meditating all over the place with Grandma's blessing and practicing deep breathing. The cats sitting importantly by him meditating as well and announcing that they used to do this in Siam. Any minute now, I expected to see the three of them wearing turbans, until once again I had an idea. This, like the snuff one, was born of desperation. We were visiting some friends who lived on the moors at the time, staying with them as the weather was bad for the night. It was winter still, of course, and all the evening Charles had been talking happily of yoga, how it mentally lifted one, raised one above bodily things. He didn't, he announced, wonderful indeed, seeing there were several degrees of frost, even feel the cold. I did. When we went to bed without bottles because we'd been talking so late and Charles said we really didn't need them, not feeling the cold, I was absolutely perished. Round about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got out and put the floor rugs on the bed, but it made no difference. I was still perished. Charles, who had rolled over while I was getting the rugs and was now comfortably cocooned in at least 3/4 of the bedclothes, informed me once more that he didn't feel the cold. Mind over matter, he assured me, snuggling cosily into his pillow. I ought to take up yoga. I ought to meditate too. I did. After a little meditation, I put my hand on one of the bedposts, one of those old-fashioned brass ones. It was, until it was icily cold. Lovingly, I burrowed through the cocoon with it in search of Charles. Tenderly, I placed it in the middle of his back. There was a loud, excruciating yell, and Charles gave up being interested in yoga. Chapter 13, with solder and crowbar. That was the winter Grandma's parrot, Laura, died, as a result, according to Grandma, of the coal man looking at her through the window. Everybody else said it was old age. To the family's knowledge, Grandma had had Laura for 30 years, and she hadn't been first-hand even then. Grandma had bought her from a pub in the belief that parrots from licensed premises, or she said from a sailor if you could get one, talked, and had kept her when she turned out to be completely dumb, except for screaming like a maniac at mealtimes, on the grounds that it was wicked to keep birds in such places, and she couldn't send her back. So after a little financial adjustment, Grandma, as she told the landlord herself, was no fool, Laura had lived with her happily for 30 years, until in recent months she had begun to droop and lose her feathers and develop a wheezy little cough. When we reminded Grandma of that, and how for weeks now Aunt Louisa had been putting whiskey in her drinking water and tying a hot water bottle to her cage every night, and still Laura had gone on failing. Grandma said it was rubbish. Laura always got bronchitis in the winter, she said. Louisa always put whiskey in her drinking water, a statement which we had to clarify when there were strangers present for the sake of Aunt Louisa's reputation, and it was no use our arguing. With her own eyes, she had seen the coal man looking through the window with his great black face. It had frightened poor Laura, and now she was dead. She was indeed, and there wasn't much we could do about it except change the coalman the following week and offer to get her another parrot. After which, the management of Grandma being rather wearing at times, Charles and I went down with flu. It wasn't so bad to begin with, when only Charles had it. True, it was unfortunate that the first day he took to his bed, I had to go to town. When I got back, the cats, whom I'd left sitting happily on his chest, enjoying his temperature, the first time Sheba announced that she had been really warm this winter, were waiting anxiously for me in the hall window. Charles hadn't fed them, complained Solomon, regarding me indignantly through the glass. Charles was groaning, said Sheba, and they'd had to come downstairs because they couldn't stand it. Charles hadn't let them out, roared Solomon, whose idea of anybody staying home, even with double pneumonia, was to let him in and out of doors all day long. Charles was hardly a little ray of sunshine either. When I went up to see him, all he said, presumably in case it helped at the inquest, was that he'd taken his temperature at 3 o'clock and it was 102. For 3 days he lay there wilting heroically, with his knees up most of the time, because Sheba had decided that in the bed, in a little cave under Charles's knees, if he would kindly raise them for her, was the warmest place to be. Calling feebly for more food, not because he was hungry, but because by the time he'd braced himself to tackle his soup or his poached place, Solomon, who didn't believe in this weaker brethren business, had appreciatively eaten the lot, assuring me when I asked how he was, that he felt very frail indeed, very frail. It was on Monday, however, when Charles was on the convalescent list and I had taken to my bed, that the fun really started. Not that it was exactly fun for me. I had a temperature too, and to my poor flu-befuddled mind, it seemed more like one of those symbolic plays where people keep walking in and out. First, it was the cats coming in with round, astonished eyes to ask what on earth I was doing there, and when was I going to get up. Lying there instead of Charles, said Sheba reproachfully, and I knew she liked it under his knees. Then it was Charles asking if he should make a cup of tea. Then, a few minutes later, it was the cats again, Charles having apparently decided there wasn't much chance of my making it anyway, appearing to report that he wasn't half mucking about in the kitchen, and he hadn't given them their breakfast yet. Then it was Solomon, howling wrathfully downstairs, charging, grumbling loudly to himself, up to his earth box in the spare room, and then appearing dramatically in the doorway once more to inform me, even in bed, I was still in charge in Solomon's little world, that Charles hadn't changed it. Charles wouldn't let him out, and if I didn't do something quick, there'd be an accident. At that point, I summoned strength to yell for Charles, whereupon the cats were let out. I got my cup of tea. Charles, flushed with achievement, announced that he would now get the breakfast, and save for a momentous creak and bang from down below, where the sitting room door latched itself firmly every time he went through, and what on earth he was doing going through it about 50 times a minute, I couldn't imagine. There was peace. It lasted about 5 minutes, at the end of which Charles called up to say the post van hadn't arrived yet, and ought he to get Solomon in, after which my next diversion was Charles in the garden calling Solomon. Shortly after that, there was the sound of a tray being deposited on the hall table. Breakfast now, I told myself, and felt quite hungry at the thought. But no, Charles, having got it that far, was once more in the garden calling Solomon. It took 20 minutes to round up Solomon and get that tray up to my bed. By that time, the toast was stone cold, which Charles said was odd because it was hot enough when he made it. The tea was cold too, colder even than the toast. Understandably so when I questioned Charles and found that he hadn't made a fresh pot. Having, he said, only poured 1 cup each out of it, and there were still bags left, he'd used the lot he'd made an hour ago. I will skim the details of the rest of the morning, taken up by the rector arriving to inquire whether he could get us anything in town. Yes, I replied gratefully via Charles, a rabbit for the cats. Charles coming up again to ask, what size rabbit? Charles shouting at me from the garden, could I see because the rector was waving to me from the road. Charles coming up 10 minutes later to ask whether I was awake and should he make some coffee, and ever and anon, the cats marching in like a Greek chorus to inquire, was I still in bed? They didn't like what Charles had given them for breakfast, and once again, Charles wouldn't let them out. By then, it was lunchtime. There was no need for Charles to ask me what he should do about that. Before he wore his legs out completely, I got up and fixed it myself. What followed was, of course, inevitable. After all that work, Charles had a relapse. By afternoon, he was back in bed, and I was tottering up with cups of tea for him. By evening, too, and there was no denying it, Sidney said he could hear him from the other end of the garden. Charles had a cough. There was no need, as Sheba said, snug once more in her little tent under Charles's knees, while Solomon lay determinedly on his chest, heaving like a storm-tossed sailor with every wheeze, to ask who was most sick in this house. It was undoubtedly Charles. He recovered eventually, of course, by the end of the week, with people going down like flies all over the village and the cats sitting on the wall happily informing people as they passed that we'd had it first. Charles, except for his cough, was quite flourishing, which was how, looking round for something to occupy us during convalescence, we came to restring the grandfather clock. You remember perhaps the grandfather clock, the one in the hall where Sheba used to sit on top and Solomon was eternally opening the door to watch it tick. We'd found a key for it eventually, and for a while there'd been peace. Sheba had given up sitting on the top. No fun in that, she said, if old Podgebelly wasn't mucking about underneath. And then one day the key broke off in the lock, and we were back where we started. Sheba sitting on the top, Solomon hanging through the door, entrancedly watching the pendulum. He was taller now than he had been, or else a bit more athletic. And when we went home one night, and when I opened the hall door, only Solomon ambled through, I had the fright of my life. No sign of Sheba, the door of the clock wide open, and the silence struck me immediately. No sound of ticking from the clock. I hardly dared look, so sure I was of what I'd find. Sheba lying in the bottom of the clock, flat as a pancake, with a weight on top of her, pushed in experimentally by Solomon, or as she was apt to do when nobody was about, having an inquisitive look on her own account and overbalancing. Sheba, as it happened, was asleep on our bed, frozen to the eiderdown, she said when I found her there a few minutes later and hugged her with relief, which was why she hadn't come down, and I'd be a lot more useful if I got her a hot water bottle. Solomon it was who'd stopped the clock. Want to see how? He inquired excitedly as I set it going again. Standing on his thin hind legs, he opened the door, reached in a long black paw and prodded the pendulum. Clever, wasn't he? He said. After that little scare, we went back to tying the door with string while we were away, and it was just as well we did. One night we went home to find that the clock had stopped again, and this time, when we opened the door to find out why, One of the weights was off. The catgut had snapped and it was lying in the bottom. So during our convalescence, it seemed an apt time to rehang it, quietly, contemplatively, with, as Charles said, plenty of time to appreciate the way craftsmen of old did their work. What the craftsmen of old did with grandfather clocks, as we discovered when we started in on ours, was to hang the weights on catgut, tie the ends in knots inside a couple of hollow cogwheels, and then bung the clock face on fast right in front of the cogwheels and fixed so firmly that we couldn't get it off. We used everything but a crowbar on it before we'd finished, and still we couldn't get it off. We never did get it off. We were in fact fast reaching the stage of jumping on it when Father Adams looked in to see how we were and informed us that you didn't put new gut in like that. Not by taking off the hands and strewing pendulum weights and pieces of clock case all over the floor. You eased it with a piece of wire if necessary, but definitely without touching the clock face, in through the tiny little holes. We managed it in the end. What Charles said before we'd finished about the craftsmen of old and those little holes must have scorched their ears even at a distance of 120 years. But we did it. We even got the clock back together again, mounted on its pinnacle and working. We have never, to this day, been able to replace the second hand. It got a bit bent when we were taking it off, and though we straightened it again with a hammer, every time we put it back, it gets hooked up in the other hands, and the clock immediately stops. For days, too, we nearly went mad because no matter what we did to it, the clock kept striking on the half hour. 5 at 4:30, for instance, and midnight at 11:30, which even in a household like ours was a little muddling. We discovered what it was eventually. We had the minute hand on upside down, a discovery that so delighted us. We forgot the vicissitudes we'd gone through to get one simple weight running on one simple piece of catgut and went round boasting of our prowess in mending clocks. Which was why, when Grandma broke the hand on her alarm clock a week or two later, she asked us, as experts, to put it right. What we did to our own clock was, as Charles remarked only the other day, nothing to what we did to Grandma's, quite by accident, of course. The clock had no glass in it to begin with. That had got broken one morning when the clock went off too early for Grandma's liking, and she had swept it onto the floor. The hand had snapped off another morning when she put the clock under the bedclothes to muffle it, and it caught in the blankets. All it needed, as Charles assured her, was a touch of solder, and it would be as good as new. The trouble there was that we weren't very expert with solder. At least 4 times we got the hand on. Success at last, said Charles each time we did it, only to find we'd soldered it to the other one, and they both went round together. And when at last we did get it on by itself, we discovered that during our endeavours, the clock face, the little circle round the hands, had been badly scorched by the soldering iron. We painted that, or rather Charles did, being the artist of the family, with aluminium paint, which made the rest of the clock face look shabby. So he painted that green, only to discover that in his enthusiasm, he'd painted over the numbers. So when the green paint was dry, he put those in again in red, at which stage, putting in the figure 12, he unfortunately touched the minute hand with his brush, and being very lightly soldered, it fell off again. And by the time we'd soldered it on once more, the aluminium painted circle behind it was not only scorched, the heat had cracked the paint. Charles was for starting all over again, but I was feeling slightly cracked myself by that time. We gave it back to Grandma as it was. The hand, as I pointed out before she had a chance to say anything, was at any rate on. Actually, Grandma was too stunned to pass much comment. Yes, she said, gazing disbelievingly at her chameleon-like alarm clock. It was. Chapter 14, right up the pole. Spring arrived in the valley at the end of March. It needed experts to detect it, mind you. Charles still had a cough. Sidney still clung firmly to his muffler. Father Adams still clumped past the cottage every morning in a balaclava that made him deafer than ever, to protect, as we heard him informing the rector at the top of the hill one day, his lugholes from the frost. But the cats knew it had come. Only a week before we had had snow, and it had been the easiest thing in the world to find them in the mornings. A small, neat line of tracks leading straight from the back door to the nearest clodge. That was Sheba, ears down, coat stuck up like a parka, a quick dig in the early peas, and in again. A trail that wound deeply through the waste like a traveller lost in the Antarctic, pausing to inspect a bush, digressing to look in the greenhouse, ambling haphazardly up the drive and ending at a frozen puddle. That, on the other hand, was Solomon, sitting interestedly on the ice and listening to it crack. We had, when we got them in again, had the usual protest meeting over the bird table, with outside little wrens and blue tits gratefully fluttering in the snow, and inside Solomon and Sheba shouting battle songs in the window. We had also witnessed an incident which Charles said sometimes came to nature lovers like us as a reward for diligence and patience. One morning, the cats, in the middle of raucous advice to the birds as to what they'd do if they laid hands on them, and it wouldn't, thought Solomon, with his eye on his old enemy, the blackbird, include giving him bacon rind either, had suddenly gone quiet. Going in to see what was wrong, on the principle that silence in a Siamese household always means trouble. There, sure enough, was Sheba hiding behind the curtain, Solomon visible only as two ears stuck periscope fashion above the windowsill, and magpies staging a raid outside. Back and forwards they were going, the great black and white wings flashing so fast between the bird table and the woods that, as Solomon said in a small, un-Solomon-like voice from beneath the sill, there must be hundreds of them out there, and it was a jolly good thing we were in. As a matter of fact, which was interesting thing about it, there were only two, working according to Charles, who understands these things, to a plan of time and motion. One chasing off the other birds and piling the cake over by the gate, and the other, the girl, Shebet, said Sheba from behind her curtain. It was always the girls who did the work, and the other one looked a lazy pants to her, like Solomon busy transporting it from the gate into the woods. But now, quite suddenly, it was spring, with Sheba sitting on the cottage roof and refusing to come down. She could, she said, see every mouse hole for miles around, and the air was fine up here. Solomon chasing a ginger tom, and Timothy arriving for the Easter holidays. We weren't quite out of the woods yet, mind you, that night looking for two little cats who had elected to stay out both ends of the day now that the spring was here. We met the ginger tom chasing Solomon, while Timothy, presumably to keep his lugholes warm too, was now wearing a crash helmet. It added, as Charles remarked, little to the decor of the cottage or to Timothy, but he refused to take it off. He also, having once renewed his acquaintance with Solomon and with us, hardly ever seemed to go home. We had Sheba on the wall busily informing people he wasn't ours, Solomon stalking admirably after him, being a space cat, Timothy himself performing landings on the lawn from Mars. Wonderful how the little chap took to us, wasn't it? Said Father Adams, beaming benignly over the gate at the Melly on his way to the Rose and Crown. which was all very well for him. People didn't tell him his little boy's trousers were coming down. People didn't tell him his little boy was calling them rude names in the lane, or encouraging a cat with a long black face to walk deliberately over their cars. People didn't tell him they thought that helmet was bad for his little boy's ears, to be met by the little boy retching realistically and sticking out his tongue. Everybody thought he was ours. It wouldn't have been so bad if he appreciated the relationship, but he didn't. He followed Charles around, informing him scathingly that he couldn't grow cabbages like his grandfather. Me, he advised professionally that my rake was no good. Breaky I would if Charlie boy didn't put a nail in it, he said. And when a little later the rake did indeed come off the handle, and I tried to slink nonchalantly past with it hidden in a bucket, did Timothy avert his gaze and ignore it like a gentleman? Like heck he did. Told I, didn't I? He said. His one saving grace was his interest in nature. And even that had complications, because when I pointed out the birds to him and Charles told him about them making their nest, and then Charles, in an unguarded moment, told him of the collection of birds' eggs he had had as a boy, we had fresh problems with Timothy. He wanted a collection too. In vain I tried to persuade him against it. All he said, while Charles looked suitably guilty, was that Charlie boy did. The best I could do, as the die was cast, was to stipulate sternly that he must never damage a nest, never frighten the bird, never take more than one egg, and then only if there were at least 3 there already, and only in any case, I said firmly, if he was going to be a naturalist. He was, he assured us, on a business basis apparently, because next time I asked about his collection, he said he had 6 hedge sparrows' eggs already. Only 1 from each nest, he assured me, as I clutched my head and groaned. But there were lots of them about, and if he swapped one with somebody who had, say, a spare moorhen's egg, that would save him disturbing a moorhen, wouldn't it? It would also, I hoped, giving the scheme my dubious blessing, stop Timothy from falling in the pond, which was something Charles, nostalgically remembering his own childhood, hadn't thought of. As it was, spurred on by a book on birds, which he persuaded Father Adams to buy for him, the next development was that Timothy started borrowing our stepladder to look at nests he'd spotted up the lane or in the woods, which meant that Charles or I, accompanied, of course, by Solomon, and, in the far reproachful distance, Sheba, had to go with him to hold the ladder and prevent him breaking his neck. That in itself wasn't too bad. It was all quite local, concentrated round a corner of the village where everybody thought we were nuts anyway. But one day Timothy turned up in a state of great excitement, announcing that he'd found a hawfinch's nest. Over by the church, he said it was, in a rather tall hawthorn, which meant taking the ladder, and as the branches were prickly, please could he borrow the shears. We all went on that expedition. I got roped in, hawthorns being rather tricky to help hold the ladder. I didn't mind that so much, but I did experience a qualm when we reached the church to find that Timothy had told us a little lie, that it wasn't, he explained, quite right here, after all, but some way down the lane. I guessed what lay ahead of me, and I was right. A procession down the road, with me trying to look as if I always went for walks carrying the rear ends of ladders, Timothy wearing his crash helmet, the cats marching happily behind. People, as I pointed out, were looking at us even then, but it was no good telling Charles. He, reliving the halcyon days of youth, was a naturalist too by this time. Take no notice, he said. So there, when we reached the tree and my final fears were realised, it was not in some corner of a hidden copse, but hanging right over the road. I stood holding the ladder while Charles pruned out the branches. Timothy directed operations from the sideline, and the cat sat conspicuously on top. Just about everybody passed us while we were there. The doctor laughing his head off, old ladies raising their eyebrows, Sidney tapping his head. What they'd be saying about us in the village, I could just imagine. But it didn't worry Charles. Not that was until he came down out of the tree. There was nothing in the nest, and it was once more a hedge sparrows, and heard what Timothy had to say. He'd just remembered, he announced. Rector had given him talking to yesterday about birds nesting. Did we think we should go back across the fields with the ladder so nobody'd know we'd been, he said. Spring, in spite of that little setback, still surged steadfastly on. Starlings started nesting in the eaves, and Solomon, trying to climb a wall to see them, fell down and hurt his foot. I made some dandelion wine, which attracted all the ants in the neighbourhood, who immediately started getting drunk in the greenhouse. The rector's cats got spring eczema and were going round self-consciously painted with Genetian violet, which scared our two practically out of their points when they saw them. They thought it was woad, they said. We started going for walks after supper, round the village in the soft spring evenings, with the cats greeting people they hadn't seen all winter, most friendlily, and people gazing apprehensively back. We went off for a few days by the sea to get our strength up for summer, and when Solomon's basket fell off its handle as we carried him into Halstock, there again was another sign. Woodworm on spring manoeuvres in the cover, the only part Solomon had left intact. And finally, the one thing we needed to convince us that spring was really with us, Tarzan, the tortoise, came back. He appeared one day as magically as he had vanished, ambling down the garden, helped by two excited paws. He didn't half look thin to him, said Solomon, lying down when we appeared and squinting anxiously under his shell. What about giving him some rabbit? Found him in the garage, said Sheba, beaming proudly at Charles, under that straw heap she'd been watching for days. And wasn't she clever? She was indeed. So was Charles, whose idea it subsequently was to paint a bullseye on Tarzan's back to match the cottage. White for the walls, he chanted, describing a neat lime-wash circle on his drab brown shell. Blue for the doors, he said, putting a small circle inside the first one, while Timothy and the cat stood admiringly by. Now, he announced, we could never lose Tarzan. We would spot him anywhere he went. Even if he got out and wandered round the village, people would know he was ours. Which was how, quite simply, we arrived at the next stage of our springtime saga. Visitors to the valley were apt to be surprised these days anyway, when at the top they met Hardy and Willis sporting purple whiskers. When rounding the corner one morning, one of them encountered Timothy in his crash helmet, a tortoise painted blue and white, Solomon, because at that moment Tarzan had stopped for a rest, looking worriedly underneath, and Sheba following them at a distance, shouting that they were all very silly and had better come right back home. He jumped and turned quite pale. That, said the villager with him, was the lot from Cats in the Belfry. The visitor mopped his brow. If he asked him, he said shakenly, we were ruddy well up the pole. Chapter 15, Cats in May. It is Maytime now in the valley. The birds are singing, the lilac is in bloom, Solomon and Sheba are molting, and judging by the ants in the greenhouse, our dandelion wine is a riot. Timothy is still with us. Father Adams never got Fred Ferry's summons after all. At the 11th hour, they united instead over a right-of-way running through some building land. Fred Perry says he remembers distinctly using it when he was courting. Father Adams says so does he, and the elm tree is up there still, from the sentimental expressions they assume when they are talking about it, I have a strong suspicion they are making it up, particularly since, if they are successful, it will result, according to Father Adams, in something unique even in this district, a footpath going through a house. Meanwhile, there being nothing like a good fight for his rights to put him in a good humour, he has arranged to keep Timothy for the summer. Doing a power of good, he explained when he broke the news to us, but he weren't much trouble, were he? We are resting now from the turmoil on the lawn. Charles has just come back from a hayfield where he has spent 2 hours looking for Timothy's scout knife, which he, Timothy that is, and Solomon lost while they were being naturalists. Tossing it up they were, wept Timothy, when a jackdaw distracted their attention. And when they looked round, it was gone. I, as a further mark of Timothy's zest to be a naturalist, am now a swallow's mum. One just a few days old, which he found lying in the lane one night in the shelter of the barn and brought to me for succour. Much good it do me too, to say I didn't know what to feed it on. Flies caught on the wing, advised Timothy pontifically, without a thought of the sight which would have ensued had we taken his advice. Charles and I and the cats catching swallows' flies on the lawn. It is, as a matter of fact, doing very nicely on boiled egg and biscuit crumbs, fed every hour, of course, which means my taking it to town during the day. But what is that to Timothy? Or to my colleagues, to whose delight with happy memories of Blondin, it feeds clinging to the front of my dress, looking open-beaked up at my mouth, and taking egg from a matchstick with aplomb. It lives, when we are at home, in the bathroom, which is why Sheba is now sitting on the bathroom windowsill, imploring us piteously to open up. Thirsty, she says she is, bawling so hard that already the rector's wife has stopped to ask if she is well. So thirsty, she can hardly speak, and we know she likes to drink from the wash basin. But as Timothy says, we want the little swallow to grow up, don't we? And fly, according to his bird book, away to Africa in the autumn, and come back again next year and nest in our roof instead of the starlings, and be a perishing nuisance for evermore, I think despondently, throwing its fledglings down for me to look after, and I bet they all like egg. I dare not say this openly, of course. We're all such naturalists now. Solomon, when I left a chicken in the kitchen this morning ready for the oven, and he, with a quick glance over his shoulder, nipped it into the yard, was quite hurt when I said he'd stolen it. Fainted it had, he assured me sorrowfully. He'd taken it out for air. Solomon, right now, is lying in a deck chair waiting for his tea and swatting, though not, I fear, with the swallow in mind, the gnat flies as they pass. Time we finished writing, he says, and probably he is right. Who, if we told them, would believe any more of our stories? About our getting a mate for Tarzan, for instance, at Timothy's suggestion. And what happened after that? Solomon, in any case, is tired, and you know who really wrote this book? Not me, if you go by his expression, but a big, seal-pointed cat.